So before introducing our speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague and our dean, Jim Glazer, who set the events in motion that brought us here today. And I would also like to thank Mindy Nierenberg and the Tisch College staff for organizing today's event. And I'd also like to single out Janine Lenahan from the Department of Political Science, who organized all the details, and most of all, Mark Shomos, who made this happen. So Mark and Janine, thank you. Now, it is our privilege to have here Lawrence Lessig, who is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School and the Director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. He is also a reformer. You are familiar with his work on copyright and cyber law and are almost certainly beneficiaries of his efforts as founder of the Creative Commons. 5 years ago, Professor Lessig announced that he's moving on to tackle institutional corruption, more particularly corruption in American politics. In these 5 years, he has spoken about corruption and money in politics at hundreds of events, including congressional testimonies, rallies, and scholarly lectures. He has published dozens of articles and several books, including Republic Lost and, most recently, Lesterland, based on his highly popular TEDx talk. Professor Lessig created the Edmund J. Safra Research Lab, a unique organization that has seen hundreds of academic and applied projects on institutional corruption to a successful conclusion. Since its creation, the lab has published both scholarly articles and high-impact investigative journalism pieces and trained scholars and practitioners alike to spread the word and encourage others to combat corruption around the country and around the world. Thoreau noted that there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil for every one who is striking at the root. Inspired by this observation, Professor Lessig is leading the fight for this republic through Root Strikers, a nationwide grassroots organization taking aim at the role of money in politics. And earlier this year, Professor Lessig led the New Hampshire Rebellion, a winter march, no less, in New Hampshire, aimed at encouraging local residents to focus the 2016 primary campaign, asking the candidates how they intend to end the system of corruption in Washington. In short, Professor Lessig is an extraordinary scholar and reformer, and it is my great pleasure to welcome him to Tufts, so please join me. Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And I want to start this talk with 3 stories. A story about a chip, a story about a poet, and a story about a boy. So first, about a chip. It's just about 20 years ago that America was informed that at the heart of the Pentium chip, there was a flaw. Deep in the code of the SRT algorithm to calculate intermediate quotients necessary for iterative floating point divisions, I don't know what that means, but I read it here, there was a flaw, an error that meant that there's a certain probability that the result of the calculation by this chip would be in error. And the probability of that happening was 1 out of every 360 billion calculations. So as Intel calculated, that meant for a spreadsheet, it would be 1 out of 27,000 years when you would discover such a flaw, which is about 26,996 years after the file format was no longer readable by your computer. So it was not a high probability event, but nonetheless, they admitted there was the chance that the calculation would be mistaken. But across the country among techies, there was outrage at this discovery. Outrage at discovery of a flaw, this error, this mistake at the core of the operating system for this chip. And the techies across the nation were not going to stand by quietly as Intel threw the integrity of their work at risk. Instead, there was a certain kind of revolution that broke out all across the world as people, well, it's not actually true, but you get the idea. They kind of rose up and demanded that Intel fix the flaw. And that demand was effective. Intel set aside $475 million to cover the cost of replacing the chips that had been discovered to be flawed. Millions of people actually took steps to replace their chips, and they fixed the flaw. Billions of dollars spent to address a problem which would occur 1 out of every 360 billion calculations. Okay, that's story 1. Here's story 2. A poet you didn't know you knew, but you do know, Martin Niemöller. He was a German pastor and theologian. Came from a town called Lippstadt, born in 1892. And around 1947, he started rehearsing a certain verse, which is very familiar to everyone, I'm sure. The verse goes, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." Now, Niemöller is trying to argue for a certain kind of insight. An insight at the core of intelligence, we might call that insight cluefulness. And you can think of it as a certain kind of a test for the intelligence of a being. Can you recognize an underlying threat and respond, and either save yourself or save your kind? So it turns out ants have this intelligence, cows not so much. But here's the challenge. Can you see the pattern, a pattern across a range of cases, and recognize in that pattern the threat and do something about it? So that's story 2. Here's story 3, about a boy, a friend of mine, named Aaron Swartz. So it was about 8 years ago when Aaron came to visit me and to ask me a question about whether I could become more clueful. He was attending a conference in Berlin, the Chaos Computer Conference. I was spending the year in Berlin, and so he came and we had dinner and spent the evening walking and talking, and the question he asked me was related to the work that I was doing. At the time, I was finishing a book about copyright and internet policy. And Aaron said to me, "How are you ever going to make progress on these questions of copyright policy or internet policy? How do you ever expect to make any progress there so long as there's this basic corruption with the way our government works?" When he asked me that question, I pushed back a little. I said, Aaron, it's not my field. And he said, "I get it. As an academic, you mean it's not your field?" And I said, "Yes, as an academic, it's not my field. I do internet policy, copyright policy." He said, "Fine. But as a citizen, is it your field as a citizen?" Now, that single question changed my life because, of course, I recognized that as a citizen, it was my field. And I recognized the truth in what he said, that all of these questions, these esoteric questions of copyright, internet policy, were never going to be answered properly so long as this basic corruption was the dynamic of our political system. And through that single question, he shamed me into a kind of cluefulness, a kind of activity that I likewise never would have pursued. Okay, that's the introduction. Here's the argument. I've been intrigued, fascinated, terrified recently by what I tried to describe as a concept we could think of it as social epistemology. It's dangerous. There turns out to be a field in philosophy called social epistemology, so I don't want to talk specifically about that field, but what I mean by it is, what do sane people say, or what do sane people do at any particular time? What is it that constrains the sane person at any particular time? Now, by sane, I mean something more than just not delusional. I think I'm aspiring to what we mean by, a normal person. What do normal people say at any particular time, and what are the disagreements that normal people are allowed to have? So, for example, you can imagine someone who says, "I support a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy." That's a normal view. Might not be your view. You recognize there are differences around that view, but that's a normal statement for someone to make. But if somebody said, I support an employer's right to condition employment on sexual favors, you wouldn't just be speaking to someone who has a different view from yours, you'd be speaking to a crazy person. This is a person who has separated him or herself from normal social society. He's so put himself outside the bounds of what's acceptable that we wouldn't treat him as just someone with a different view. Now we can think of the difference here as a difference between contested views and uncontested views. And by that I mean normatively contested views or uncontested views, which means views which we are allowed to contest, socially permitted to contest, as distinct from views we are not socially permitted to contest. So we in the society are permitted to contest the idea that a woman has a right to terminate a pregnancy. That's a permissible contested view. But we are not permitted to contest the idea that you shouldn't be able to condition employment on providing sexual favors. That's not permitted within our society. We have ruled that out of bounds. And when you begin to distinguish between the sense of contested and the sense of uncontested, and when you're raised in an academic environment where every view has to fit a matrix, so we can think about that distinction against another distinction, which I would submit is, I mean in a more empirical sense, foregrounded versus backgrounded views. And so the intersection of these two dimensions, we can recognize abortion then as a foregrounded contested view. It's an issue people talk about and we're permitted to disagree. Quid pro quo sexual harassment is a foregrounded uncontested view. We talk about it, it's an issue in our society, but no one's permitted to take the other side of that view, or if you do, you pay significantly in social costs. Then we can think of backgrounded, uncontested views, infanticide. Every once in a while this issue surfaces because some woman, some tragic story comes out of a woman terminating a pregnancy after a baby has been born. But it's the sort of issue where we all recognize the right and wrong about this issue, and if you openly espouse the idea that you can commit infanticide, again, you set yourself off. In ordinary context, right? So if you read Bruce Ackerman's Social Justice in the Liberal State, and you study it carefully in a seminar of philosophy in a closed room with not a lot of air circulating, you will come to the point in that book where he convinces you that, in fact, a baby, until it can engage in dialogic reasoning, is much like a fetus. So there's no reason to say you can't terminate a baby before it's engaged in dialogic reasoning. All the rights of a human come when the baby can talk. Now that's an idea you can sustain for a little bit of time in a philosophy seminar, but once you step outside into the clear air, all belief in that idea disappears, and you realize only a crazy person, I love Bruce Ackerman, but only a crazy person could assert something like that, because again, it is marked as an uncontested view in our society. And then I want to fill in this other box through a little bit of an experiment. The button-down shirt as a backgrounded contested view. Okay, so here's a shirt. How many people believe that's a button-down shirt? Just raise your hand. Okay, this is astonishing, all right? Okay, almost everyone believes that's a button-down shirt. It's not a button-down shirt. Button-down shirt, according to most dictionaries, are shirts that have the collar fastened with a button. So most people go through society not recognizing that's not a button-down shirt. Why? Well, because it's not an issue, I think, I would submit it's never been raised at Tufts University, this issue. Nobody ever in the history of Tufts has raised this issue. So it survives in a contested space, backgrounded, because nobody talks about it. But the point about this category is that this category is the opportunity for social entrepreneurs. What social entrepreneurs do is they discover issues in that box, and they think about how can they raise them to the foreground so as to resolve them in a different way. So think about sexual harassment in the 1960s. It was an issue that was formally backgrounded. A lot of people, of course, were concerned about it, but it wasn't an issue that was surfaced much. Perhaps the greatest legal academic in the 20th century, at least, Catherine McKinnon, through a series of really innovative legal actions, succeeded in foregrounding it by claiming that quid pro quo sexual harassment was a type of inequality, that it was a violation of laws that forbid inequality in the employment context. And very quickly she won. And those issues became uncontested in the courts. Even a conservative Supreme Court found it trivially easy to say that a statute passed in the 1960s in a time when not one member of Congress was thinking how it was going to abolish quid pro quo sexual harassment. The Supreme Court said, yeah, of course, it abolishes quid pro quo sexual harassment because it's a form of inequality. So it becomes an uncontested foregrounded view, and we can imagine eventually, we can hope eventually, it just falls to the background. We don't have to deal with it anymore. But the point about this dynamic is that that box, the button-down shirt box, is the opportunity for social entrepreneurs to identify issues and push them forward in a way that really manifests significant social change. Now, throughout the process of somebody standing in a contested or uncontested space, there is someone who knows something who others might reject, that others would reject. And the question I want to think about here is, what do you do when you find yourself in a place where you believe something that you know normal people around you reject? Okay, now I'm going to commit a terrible sin here, because I'm going to show you a clip from a really fantastic television series, which might be a spoiler for some of you who haven't seen this yet. All of you should see this. But you should see it, I think, because it's an incredibly interesting explication of the problem of social epistemology. So it comes from this series, House of Cards, which I don't think is so interesting in its description of Congress, although it's fun drama about its description of Congress. But it is incredibly interesting in giving us a real sense of what it means to be in this place where what you believe you know, you also know everybody around you thinks is insane. Okay, so in this story, the vice president, of course played by Kevin Spacey, Frank Underwood, turns out to be a murderer, literally murders people with his own hands. Okay. And then there's some people in the press who believe they know this. Lucas Goodwin, who's played by Sebastian Arcelus, and believes he knows, and Constance Zimmer, who plays Janine Skorsky, and Boris McGiver, who plays Tom Hammerschmidt. Each of these three are members of journalist space. One of them was a former editor. Lucas is a current editor, and Janine is an editor/reporter. All of them believe that they know that the vice president is a murderer. But the point of the series is that we know for sure the vice president is a murderer, because we've seen it. We've seen the sequence of the murders. Okay, so there's no ambiguity in our head about this. Here we have two people who believe they know the truth. Janine and the guy who's, for reasons I'm not going to go into, locked up in jail right now, believe they know the truth. She's trying to convince him he can't utter the truth. She won't utter the truth. Because in the context of the story and in the context of our world, it's just unbelievable, not socially believable, that the vice president is engaged in acts which constitute murder. And the middle guy, the guy who was writing the story, is sympathetic. He's not sure, but he's providing the kind of independent third-person perspective. Just imagine what it would be like to hear this, recognize nobody would believe this. And so the story is how we recognize the truth and yet recognize how others can't see the truth. That's the constraint of what I want to mean by social epistemology. Now, there are lots of examples of this out there, especially recently there are such examples. This is a guy named Roger Stone. Roger Stone is a former aide of Richard Nixon. As Wikipedia describes him, he was described as a renowned infighter during the 2004 presidential campaign. CBS News describes him as a veteran Republican strategist. 2008 Daily Beast described him as a self-admitted hitman for the GOP. Not literally, I'm not talking about more murder here, but, hitman for the GOP. Roger Stone finds himself, I suggest, in a similar conundrum. social epistemological conundrum. He's just published this book that alleges that that vice president engaged in murder. He believes, as he constructs in that book, that that vice president was involved in a conspiracy that led to the murder of JFK. Now, we look at that, and we should have some empathy, I suggest, for Roger Stone, because Roger Stone's put himself in a place where most people think he must be crazy. Or think about the people who deny the truth that we've been told around 9/11, people who believe that the government knew about this conspiracy. According to Zagby, actually 50% of New Yorkers believe the government knew about the events leading up to 9/11. But once again, the people who find themselves confronting facts which lead them to stand up and say, I believe the government conspired to commit the acts that led to 9/11, face a certain kind of social plight. They're faced a plight because they find the world sees them as not normal. They disqualify themselves if they stand too far outside what everybody else believes is true. Now, about those particular examples, about 9/11, about whether JFK was killed by Johnson, I think we're pretty confident we know what the truth is. But of course, historically, what's interesting is there are all sorts of similar examples where the truth has been reversed. So of course, it's taken for granted at the time Dred Scott's decided that a court could assert that for more than a century, Negroes had been regarded as an inferior order, altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations. So imagine yourself as the person who disagrees with that, or believes that's not true. Or just 20 years later, the Supreme Court could assert man is or should be a woman's protector and defender. The natural proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of social life. Imagine you were the sort of insane person like Myra Bradwell who believed that that statement wasn't true. Or even at the middle of the last century, the most liberal justice on the Supreme Court could say this about homosexuality. Homosexual is the one who fails to reach a sexual maturity and who remains at a narcissistic or homosexual stage, the products of hereditary or glandular dysfunction. This was liberalism in the late 1960s. Imagine you happen not to believe that and wanted to assert the opposite. The point is to think about, in each of those cases, what is the strategy? What are the moves that you make to get something from an uncontested into a contested into a newly uncontested space? Okay, I set that problem up because in the work that I do, my closest friends call me insane. Or when they're being nice in public, they say, quixotic, quixotic. They do that because they recognize a certain kind of truth about the struggle which I am in the middle of. If you listen to the Chatterati in America, they say that the interesting division in American politics is between the left side and the right side. But the interesting division in American politics, I think, is between the inside and the outside. The inside, what we can think of as life within the Beltway of Washington, and the outside, the rest of the United States. And if you think about the problem in this way, I think you should recognize that the inside, Washington, is a certain kind of economy. It's an economy where the important elements here are lobbyists, members of Congress, and the interests that hire the lobbyists. And as described in this great book by Robert Kaiser, that economy has changed. And it's changed as we've seen a radical change in the way lobbying functions within this economy. So lobbyists affect members, and members affect the interests that are hiring the lobbyists. According to the way Kaiser lays this out, each of them pays the other. Each of them depends on the other. So interests pay the lobbyists. As Kaiser writes, in earlier generations, enterprising young men came to Washington looking for power and political advantage, often with ambition to save or reform the country or the world. In the last fourth of the 20th century, such aspirations were supplanted by another familiar American yearning to get rich. As he describes the lobbying industry, which is about $9 to $12 billion at the time he's writing, This is an extraordinary change in the influence in Washington. The lead lobbyist he describes, Gerald Cassidy, now worth $100 million earned through lobbying work alone, producing an incredible wealth boom in Washington. Some of the fastest growing and wealthiest counties in the country now are counties around our country's capital. All of that in the product of an economy designed to sell policy to those who are eager to see policy changed. And then lobbyists affect members, pay members, both during and after their term. During their term, lobbyists pay with cash, and I don't mean they hand out cash in brown paper bags. I'm not talking about anything illegal. They pay by supporting campaigns. As the cost of campaigns has gone through the roof, members become increasingly dependent on a reliable source of cash. Members who spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power live in a certain life. They have a certain practice. And we need to think about what that practice does to them as they spend their time dialing for dollars. Right? B.F. Skinner gave us this image called the Skinner box. I could have had a rat, but I used a pigeon just to be nice here. So in the Skinner box, even a stupid animal like a pigeon can learn which buttons it needs to push in order to get the sustenance it needs to survive. We need to recognize this is the image of the modern American congressperson as he or she learns which buttons he or she needs to push through the 30 to 70% of time that they spend raising money to get the sustenance that he or she needs to run the campaign or to get their party back into power. So it's first the amount of time they spend fundraising, but it's not just the amount of time that causes the dynamic I'm describing. It's also from whom they raise that money. They raise this money not from all of us, but from the tiniest fraction of the 1% of us. And I mean here really, really tiny. It is a tiny 0.05% of America that are the relevant funders of campaigns, meaning they give enough money to be noticed or recognized or subject to such a call. 0.05% means about 150,000 Americans, which the internet tells me is about the same number as are named Lester in the United States, which is why I describe this as Lesterland, the place that we live. Lesters who have this extraordinary influence because they are the tiny fraction of the 1% who gets called. Now, lobbyists play a central role in this economy of fundraising. Lobbyists become a kind of supplier. We could think of them as pushers in the dynamic of raising money because they guarantee easier access to this thing that members need, campaign funds. Now, this dynamic, of course, has always existed in some form, but as Kaiser describes, it is in its current form new. As he writes, money has been a part of American politics forever, on occasion in the Gilded Age or the Harding administration, for example, much more blatantly than recently. But the scale of it has just gotten way out of hand. The money may have come in brown paper bags in earlier eras, but the politicians needed and took much less of it than they take through more formal channels today. So compare this chairman, Max Baucus of the Finance Committee, man who represented 0.3% of the American population, but was the lead fundraiser as Senate committees in one term, raising $4 million from the people who his committee would be regulating. He's the modern instance of the way fundraising functions. Compare him with this man, John Stennis, a Democrat from Mississippi, who was in the Senate between 1947 and 1989, was head of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And Stennis was asked by a colleague to have a fundraiser in the early 1980s for defense contractors. And John Stennis replied, would that be proper? I hold life and death over these companies. I don't think it would be proper for me to take money from them. Now, this view is a view that is literally not utterable today in Washington, because the norm in Washington today is that a committee chairman loses his or her power over the target of their regulation to raise money. But the radical change in that social norm, what's utterable, is manifestation of Kaiser's claim that this is a radically new sphere. So that's during their time in Congress, but then after their time in Congress too, the lobbyists pay the members. They pay them with a future. I interviewed Jack Abramoff at Harvard, and Jack retold a story that he tells in his book, a really fantastic story to capture the dynamic of that economy. And he said, the most effective technique I had as a lobbyist was that I would walk into a Senate office and I would talk to the chief of staff and I would say, what are you doing after you're out of here? And the guy said, well, I don't know, Jack. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet. And Jack would say, I want you to look me up. And Abramoff said, from that moment on, I owned that chief of staff, and not a single dollar had changed hands. Because what he is describing is a fact that has become increasingly common in Washington. What Jim Cooper describes, the dynamic of Capitol Hill becoming a farm league for K Street where the lobbyists work. And what he means is members and staffers and bureaucrats in Washington have an increasingly common business model, a business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. 50% of the Senate between 98 and 2004 left to become lobbyists, 42% of the House. Those numbers have only gone up, and as United Republic calculated a year ago in April, the average salary increase for members who are leaving was 1,452%. So in a world where people are constantly focused on their future, they become increasingly responsive to those who pay the future, namely the lobbyists. So in this sense, both during and after a time in Congress, the lobbyists are paying the members, and then the members return the favors to the interests through policies that get changed, sometimes incredibly profitable. This paper from the University of Kansas describes the return on investment for this lobbying expenditure as 22,000%. So the money spent earned the companies 22,000% in profit. Sometimes quite brazenly, this is John Campbell, representative from California, who used to run used car dealerships, continues to have an interest that's worth between $600,000 and $6 million in car dealerships. Not clear because of the way ethics rules are written, which end of that spectrum he's on. He's raised about $200,000 from car dealerships in the cycle leading up to the event I'm going to describe. So he's invested and committed directly to the interests of car dealerships. And then what he did during the establishment of the Consumer Financial Protection Agency was he introduced an amendment because he suggested there was no reason to worry about the financial relationships of used car dealers and consumers. That amendment exempted used car dealers from the provision of this statute. Democrats and Republicans voted for that amendment. And as Maplight calculated, the reason Democrats did, even though it was completely against the purpose of that amendment, was that they found the amount of money they could raise was twice as much as Democrats who didn't vote in favor of the amendment to exempt used car dealers. Now, what's interesting about this mix in this economy is that among academics, the only one that's really questioned much is this relationship, whether in fact members return favors to the interest. And I'm not going to spend time on that claim. I'm happy to address it in the questions because I believe it's established in a way that we should rely on. But the point is to recognize the way if these interests feed together. And the key here to this economy is to see the way it has changed. And its change leads to this question: can we change that economy again? Can we imagine changing it to one where there wasn't this type of dynamic in the way Washington works? Now, it's at least hard to imagine changing it again. Maybe it's impossibly hard. And it's that which leads people to say it's quixotic to imagine that you could change it. Indeed, if you talk to the pundits will tell you quite directly, as I was told on a television show I was on with Dan Rather, that it was, quote, impossible to change that dynamic. As I was told, Americans don't care about this issue, and there is never going to be an election that turns or gets changed because of a focus on this underlying dynamic. Okay, so that's a challenge. It's a challenge for me, for someone who wants to avoid being in the position of these people, finding themselves uttering statements which the rest of the world thinks are just plain crazy. So how is it? This is the challenge. This is the question that I wanted this lecture to be about. How is it one navigates between the truth no one will admit and the truth you can't help but believe? And I want to suggest there are three techniques that I've tried to deploy, not yet successfully, but to deploy. The first technique is to show how to see the issue. And this is what's so compelling about the image of the computer chip that is flawed. Because if you think about the way our government works, against the background of that story, we should acknowledge a certain corruption has worked its way into the operating system of our government. Our government was set up not as a democracy, but as a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as Federalist 52 describes, a government that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone. So this is their model, the people and the government, an exclusive dependence. But the problem, of course, is that we've allowed a different dependence to evolve, a dependence on the funders too. This is a dependence too. And it's different and conflicting from a dependence on the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. And just in case this isn't clear, let me make it perfectly clear. The funders are not the people. The funders represent, in no sense, the people as a whole. They represent a slice of the interests of the people, yet they have an enormous effect on the way in which the agenda of our nation is set. This is a corruption. It's a corruption that we can understand by analogy to a corruption of the chip at the core of our government, but unlike the Intel Pentium chip, it's not 1 out of 360 billion times that corruption manifests itself. It is every time, with every important issue, that our government needs to address, the issues that you care about, that we care about. It's with every one of them that this system makes it impossible for sensible policy to be embraced. We need to see it like this, to see it as a corruption. That's step one. Then there's step two. To describe it, to define it, is not enough to show its significance. So we need the second step to see its significance. And here's where that certain kind of cluefulness is necessary, the ability to recognize a pattern, to see how these issues are connected. And indeed, I think if you step back and you think about the issues that people on the left and the right care about and connect the dots, whether it's healthcare reform on the left or government bailouts on the right, or global warming legislation on the left, or a complex tax system on the right, or financial reform on the left, or financial reform on the right, there is a common pattern here, a pattern that makes it impossible for the government to address these issues sensibly, a pattern that makes it possible for reform to be blocked systematically by the capacity of this tiny, tiny number to exercise the influence that they have. And what we need to do is to become less like cows and more like ants in the face of this recognition, to recognize how they are linked and to be able to act in response to that link. And then number three, when you see the link about the issues you care about and the issues you have less care about, you might think, well, this is why this system's bad for me. But the third step is to move beyond why it's bad for you to why it's wrong. To appeal to ideals maybe of loyalty or morality or simple ideas of right and wrong. And this was the move that Aaron tried to introduce through the questions that Aaron was pushing. It's not because this is what we as individuals or experts would want, that he wanted me to focus in the way that I am now focused. It's because that's what citizens do. That's what citizens do. It's not to say, then, that's enough. It's to show that becomes so important. And it's here that another link was obvious that I hadn't seen before he spoke to me. You know, it's a startling fact that you recognize that after a war, which in the classic bait and switch Lincoln defined as a war about the proposition that all men are created equal, a war that then produced an amendment that declared that race shall not be a factor in allocating the right to vote, an amendment which imagined a future like this, it's a little bit amazing to remember that in fact we got instead a future like that. For almost 70 years, the nation continued to struggle around the right to vote for African Americans because of a concerted effort to exclude African Americans from their ability to vote. And the most extreme example of that comes from the grand state of Texas, which formally, explicitly adopted something called the all-white primary. And the all-white primary explicitly said African Americans were not permitted to vote in the Democratic primary. Now, all of these devices were designed to keep blacks out from participating equally in the political process. And so the Old South, you could say, was something like this. There were two elections, a general election and the white primary. In the general election, all citizens got to vote, but in the white primary, only whites got to vote. And to be able to, you had to win in the white primary to have a real shot of running in the general election. That was the picture of democracy in the Old South. And so what can we say about that democracy? Well, we can say, number one, the Supreme Court was right in describing a different democracy, but it has the same feature. The people in the Old South had the ultimate influence over elected officials, because after all, there was a general election. But they had that influence only after the whites had had their way with the candidates who wished to run in that general election. So it was ultimate influence, but not necessarily the most significant influence. And number two, obviously, this denial of equal rights was a denial of a certain kind of dignity, equal dignity. Of course, this is not the only denial of dignity African Americans suffered in our history, but this was a denial of the equal dignity of citizenship, which says that we all must, in a moral democracy, have an equal right to participate in the selection of our representatives. And indeed, this was so fundamental and ideal, as described in this great book by Stephen Ash, say African-American Sergeant Henry Maxwell, who was a member of the 3rd Black Memphians, who attended a colored man's convention in 1865 and gave a speech, and this is what he said: "We want the rights guaranteed by the infinite architect. For those rights we labor, for them we will die. We have gained one. The uniform is its badge. We want 2 more boxes besides the cartridge box, the ballot and the jury box. Those boxes were the elements of any equal citizenship. The right to participate in all 3 of those spheres was what citizenship was about." Now, of course, we denied that right to African Americans until formally the middle part of the 1940s. 1944, the white primary was eventually overturned. But in the process of fighting for those rights, there was a certain way in which the indignity was demonstrated, was shown. And the inspiration for much of the reform came from the way in which that indignity was shown. Here's one very important story. This is a guy named Lonnie Smith, who was a doctor. He was a dentist. And every election, Lonnie Smith would get up, walk the 3 miles to his polling place, pay his poll tax, and then ask for a ballot. And every election, the ballot officials would say, "Dr. Smith, you know you're not allowed to vote." And he would say, "Thank you very much," and he would turn around and he would walk home. And people would watch him walking through the city, this act of civil disobedience, respectful, with honor, with pride, expressing the deep injustice of that political system. And when you think of Lonnie Smith and you think of that struggle, there's an obvious parallel we should recognize about our democracy today. Because we too have produced a democracy with 2 elections again. There is an election which we can think of as a discrete election. It happens on 2 particular days every election cycle. But then there's another election, a continuous election, that happens 24/7 between one election and the other. In the discrete election, we can call the voting election, candidates ask all of us to vote for them so that they can be elected. But in the continuous election, what we could call the green primary, candidates are asking the funders to fund their election. So the voting election is one where all citizens get to vote, but the green primary is one where only the relevant funders get to vote. And to be able to run successfully in the voting election, you must do extremely well in the green primary. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. Now, that picture of democracy is exactly the picture of democracy from the Old South. This picture of democracy is once again a democracy which has created two classes of participants. But unlike the Old South, where the white primary represented the vast majority of citizens, 80% of the citizens were still white, in this primary, it's the tiniest fraction of the 1% who exercise this influence disproportionate to their role in the population. Now, others have seen this before. Jamie Rashkin and John Boniface described this in 1994 as the wealth primary, but we should recognize the way in which it parallels the dynamic of democracy that I described for the Old South. Because we could say, yes, the Supreme Court was absolutely right. In our system, the people have the ultimate influence, despite that green primary, because there is an ultimate general election where all the citizens get to vote. But they have that influence after the funders have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. So it's an ultimate influence, but it is not necessarily the most significant or most important in defining what the elections are about. And number two, obviously, there's a certain dignity that is lost in a system like that, the equal dignity of citizenship, which is denied in any system that structures electoral power like this. So here, too, there's a need to show that indignity, to show it and demonstrate it the way Dr. Smith demonstrated it, to do it in a way that reminds people at every election of how the system we've allowed to evolve has denied this basic principle of the morality of democracy. So you've all heard, I'm sure, this quote by Ben Franklin as he's carried from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, stopped on the streets of Philadelphia and asked Mr. Franklin, "What have you wrought?" And Franklin says, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. If you can keep it. A republic. A representative democracy. A government dependent on the people alone. There can be no doubt but that we have lost that republic. We have lost that republic because of a fundamental flaw we've allowed to evolve inside the core of the way this democracy functions. A flaw producing a pattern we should recognize, a pattern which destroys the possibility of sensible governance. We must find a way to get a clue as a people about that, to end our bovine reaction and embrace a much more fundamentally responsive action, to see the indignity, not necessarily as politicians, certainly not as experts, but to see the indignity, to feel it as citizens. And once we do, we have to be willing to become a little bit insane about it, a little insane about it. The willingness to step out just a bit from what feels comfortable, from what feels easy. The willingness to speak despite it not being our expertise, despite it not being our field, because of course it is our field as citizens. To do it not because this is what we do best, but because that is what citizens do, which it took a 20-something to remind me and to lead me, and which it should lead all of us to do as well. Thank you very much. Should we take questions? So happy to take questions. Right here, yeah.
Hello. I've never seen anyone use, I'm not sure if that's PowerPoint, but
It's magic. It's just magic, that's all.
good.
Thanks.
So as an undergrad political scientist, I have actually read a lot of different papers, and one of them that has stuck out to me is called The Nature of Belief Systems in Mass Publics by Philip Converse. And the implication of that article is that elites, political elites, think of things in more abstract terms than the mass publics, who think about things such as, you know, what does this politician do for me? What does this mean for my family? So I know that you're standing here in front of people who are sort of elites, not everyone necessarily, but we're the lucky few who get to have the leisure of thinking about things in abstract terms. So imagine that you're in front of people who are, you know, working class citizens who don't have the time necessarily to hear all of this and process all of this information. So would you do anything differently in the way that you teach this?
It's a great question. So I've been working on this now for 7 years. For many of those 7 years, I was convinced that we had to teach ordinary people about the problem. And I've become convinced that there's nothing to teach. They get it. They might not think in abstract terms about all sorts of issues, and they might be, as politicians say, really interested about particular issues. But I think as Hibbings and Thibault make very clear, we have a very clear sense of the basic justice or injustice of this system. And the vast majority of Americans recognize the injustice in the system. We did a poll at the end of last year that found 96% who believe that the influence of money in politics needs to be reduced. 96% think it's important, 68% think it's very important, but 96% think it's important. And that means that everybody, you know, who is that 4%? When I was doing my walk through New Hampshire, 185 miles through New Hampshire, it was my shtick to kind of say, are you one of the 4%? Because I'm looking for that 4%. Who are those people who don't believe this? But okay, we all believe this because I think in some sense we've taught the American people again and again this fact. But then that leads to the question, why are the pundits so correct when they say people don't vote on this issue? And it's not because they don't care about it. And it turns out this is the one issue the pundits are wrong about. They're wrong about this. It's not because they don't care about it. It's because of a second fact, which we discovered in the same poll. So we found 96% think it important to reduce the influence of money in politics. 91% don't believe it's possible. Don't believe it's possible. So at least 96% of us would want to fly like Superman, but at least 91% of us don't believe it's possible, which explains why we don't systematically throw ourselves off of the, you know, that beautiful parking lot you've got over there, you know, to try to do it, to try to fly like Superman, because we're convinced we just can't do it. As much as we'd want it, we don't do it. And it's the same dynamic that's going on here. So the thing that I think we need to do to, you know, the public is to give them a sense that there's a way to fix it. There's hope. Give them hope that there's something to do. Because if you could begin to crack the sense that there's nothing to do, if you could thaw that cynicism, that pessimism, or that resignation, then I think they'd love to find a way to act and do something about it. And again, on this march, we saw this again and again. You just walk down the streets, people running out of their house in their pajamas to celebrate, to scream in support of a march that was about trying to find a way to address this issue. So I think the really important step for this movement is just map it, make it easy for people to see what we could do, and then give them a reason to hope that there's something to do. Because we're finished with needing to convince people there's a problem here. They're there, they're with us on that.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering if you think that this is a US phenomenon or if there's other countries, democracies to point to as good examples to show that there's a way to do it differently.
Well, there's something very troubling about democracy around the world. 70 years ago, if you said, what's going to solve government's problems around the world? The answer would have been, we just have to spread democracy. And if we spread democracy around the world, everything will be great. And we did spread democracy around the world. It's basically everywhere. Some important exceptions, but okay, we can bracket those. But in the places where it is, in fact, cynicism and skepticism about government has just radically increased. And my view is, there's a version of the corruption argument you can make about most democracies around the world. Its dynamic is not the same as American, but there's a similar version that's existing in many of the great democracies around the world. Sometimes it's the old-fashioned kind of quid pro quo bribery. Sometimes it's the influence of an elite culture. But whatever, there's a dynamic that's similar, and you can translate and identify it across democracies around the world. But there are democracies that succeed, I think, in escaping the sense of this. The Nordic countries have democracies where there isn't the same sense of cynicism about it. And what distinguishes them are, number one, constitutional restrictions. So the American system is constrained by a First Amendment that's been interpreted to radically restrict the legislative responses to this problem. So in other countries around the world, campaigns are limited to a certain period. Television is radically regulated about what can be on television. You have to give free time to people. All of those remedies are unavailable in America because the First Amendment sets them off the table. So we have a different constitutional structure, and we have a different historical support for independence-inducing funding mechanisms, right? So the problem, as I see it, is the problem of how we fund campaigns, or more precisely, how candidates raise the money for campaigns. And other countries have different ways of funding campaigns. They have public funding of parties, or they have public funding that allows people to escape this cycle of fundraising. And that's the sort of change that we need to embrace here. So if we did, I think it would radically change the grounds for that kind of cynicism. But I don't think it's a simple problem to imagine us getting to a simple problem to solve, to get us to the place where people have this faith again in the way democracy is supposed to function. Yeah.
My name is Ibrahim Warde. I teach a course here at the Fletcher School, among other courses, a specific course that deals with corruption that's about informal and underground finance. And I'm writing a book on finance and ethics. So I'm very interested in your work in general. And I loved your book, Republic Lost, and your talk too as well. So I have just a comment and then a question at the end. The comment is that it looks to me, again, studying the same kinds of subjects, that there's quite a bit of knowledge out there about how outrageous the behavior that you described is. I could think offhand of about 20 books that were written in the last 2-3 years documenting what you're talking about. And what I want to ask you about is the broader question of culture, which is the acceptability of a certain kind of behavior, in that back in the 50s, there was this whole notion of like, have you no shame, sir, at long last, which destabilized McCarthy. And we have the sense of shamelessness in what's going on right now. There's a bit of a greed is good culture, et cetera. And so my question to you is, what could be done, again, beyond the element of getting people to know how outrageous this behavior is? What do you think about this cultural argument, and could it be changed, or is it a much slower process? Thank you.
Yeah, so the focus of the center, which Mark Chalmers is so important in defining our research agenda, because he's the research director of the center, the focus of the center is on a different kind of corruption. And it's been important to me to distinguish it, in part in a kind of controversial way, focused on really the mens rea of the people participating. So the old-fashioned kind of corruption, bribery, or quid pro quo corruption, is the kind of corruption where somebody knows that he or she is doing something wrong. You can think of it as bad soul corruption. These are bad people doing bad things. But the kind of corruption I want to talk about is good soul corruption. People who aren't necessarily doing anything wrong. People who are doing legal, even currently ethical acts, which nonetheless have the consequence of corrupting the ability of the institution to serve its functions. So, for example, in Congress, there's nothing illegal in raising money the way that they raise money. There's nothing unethical about it. And indeed, as long as it's disclosed, people are completely open about it. And so when you describe the shamelessness of the system, it's because the system doesn't have an ethic that describes what's being done here as wrong. Why be ashamed of it? It's completely legal. And in fact, right now, they brag about it. Like the way in which you demonstrate your power in the party is by basically having a list of all the people you've raised money from. So I'm a $40 million person, you're a $20 million person, I'm more powerful than you are. So it's shameless because there's nothing, according to their frame, wrong in their activity. And indeed, this makes the problem harder to address. Because the virtue of the old-fashioned kind of corruption is that the shamefulness of it at least led people to keep it underground. They would have to hide it. They would be, there's a certain amount of resistance or restriction on it. But now, there's nothing to resist it, nothing to restrict it. And so in my own view, if you look at the actual costs of these two kinds of corruption, the intuition is that the bad corruption is the really costly one. But I think the good soul corruption is actually ultimately much more costly to the political system because of the radical distortions it introduces with nobody feeling any responsibility for it at all because it's all ratified. So the challenge for corruption reformers in this space is how do you raise a resistance to this form of good soul corruption? Now, in those 20 books that you would list, I think probably 18 of them answer that question by trying to describe the behavior as evil. So you talking about the corrupt members of Congress who were there trading stock, day trading on the floor of Congress, and this is the way in which they're making all their money. These are really bad people. And the problem with that description is I just don't think it's true. It's just not true. And I think there's a kind of dissonance that people have when they think about that description of Congress, and then they meet their congressperson. Because whether you'd like your congressperson to marry your daughter or not, the point is, these are not evil people, right? This is not sort of gross behavior by people you just don't have any. These are decent people, hardworking people who go to Congress for the right reason. So there's this dissonance between thinking of them as these corrupt self-dealers who are engaging in criminal acts and actually confronting the people who we see as members of Congress. And I think that's because it's not true to describe them as these corrupt people engaging in corrupt acts. Somehow we've got to find the way to motivate resistance to corrupt systems that doesn't depend on us believing they're evil people in the corrupt systems. And that's a hard problem. I think that we as a culture, as a political society, are capable of rising up and taking down the Richard Nixons. But what if it's not Richard Nixon? What if it's not people who engage in acts that are just plainly illegal? Do we have the capacity to actually motivate ourselves to do something about that? And for many years, I worried we didn't. And my source of optimism now is we don't, but only because we don't see how it's possible. But if we could really convince that there's a possible way to do it, I think, in fact, we could motivate people to do something about it, or at least that's the bet that's motivating the work that I want to do. Yeah.
At the end of Republic Lost, you outlined a couple visions of yours, if that's fair, for ways to kind of bring down corruption in our political system. I was wondering if you might give some updates on, since that was written a few years ago, on what you think might be viable now.
Yeah, so there are three particular strategies that I outlined as plausible, really exercises to think about how to make reform. So one of them was the Article 5 convention process. In the Article 5 convention process, the Constitution was originally drafted to say that only Congress could propose amendments to the Constitution. Then Mason stands up on the floor of the convention and says, well, what if Congress is the problem? So like, duh, yeah, we've got to think about a way around that. And so they said, well, states have the right to call on Congress to call for an Article 5 convention whose only power is to propose amendments to the Constitution. Now, there is a much more vibrant today than when I wrote that book, Article 5 convention movement that is interestingly, increasingly cross-partisan. When I wrote that book, there was a bunch of right-wing Article 5 organizations out there. But now there's a very strong left-wing Article 5 organization out there, something called Wolf Pack, run by Cenk Uygur, who runs the Young Turk Network, which is now got representatives in 25 states that they think are they're going to get resolutions passed. And so that probability of at least getting to a convention, I think, is much higher than I thought it was back then. Second strategy I described was a strategy of getting candidates to run for Congress on this issue explicitly. And we haven't seen any great move on that. And I think that's partly because the economy of running for Congress is that you have to raise $1 bajillion to be credible. Well, if you're raising $1 bajillion, it's hard to credibly say the problem is the way we've got to raise $1 bajillion to run for Congress. I mean, when I first started doing this work, Joe Trippi, who ran Dean's campaign, tried to persuade me to run for Congress. And he said, now here's the thing, you've got to be willing to commit to me that you will spend 2 to 4 hours every day calling people asking for money. And I said, Joe, how can I spend 4 to 5 to 6 hours a day talking about the corruption of a system where people have to be calling people to raise their money and then spend 2 to 4 hours every day calling people to raise money? It's just psychologically not really healthy, at least. And I realized I couldn't do it, but then I began to think, well, who are the people who can do that? And of course, those are not likely to be the people who are going to make a campaign on the basis of the money. The third strategy, which I ultimately think is actually the only one that will work, was the idea of having someone run for president who says, look, I'm going to do one thing and then I'm resigning. The one thing I'm going to do is pass this reform package, whatever that reform package is, and then I'm resigning. So number one, I'm going to do it, unlike the kind of Lucy, Charlie Brown scenario we've gone through for the last 30 years, where every time somebody says, yes, I'm going to do reform, and then bingo, once they're elected, they do nothing. My friend Barack Obama, the latest example of that. So you know that this is the measure of success, that he or she will do this one thing. And you know that he or she steps aside once they do it, so you can go back to a normal presidency. So you can imagine the campaign then develops so that you're thinking about, well, who's the vice president that will be running with this person? Because what I'm going to get is a twofer. I'm going to get reform from a person whose only measure of success is reform, and then I'm going to get another president who's going to go on and do the things that a normal president says they're going to do. And if that person were elected, there could be no ambiguity about what the mandate of the people is. That's the mandate, to have this kind of reform. And I actually think, somebody actually then, after I wrote the book, did a formal model to show that this was true. So I didn't have the formal model capabilities, but he demonstrated the formal model that it was true. If that reform strategy began to get any traction, it would put enormous pressure on the other party to do the same thing, so that you would have 2 reform candidates, each of them pointing to their vice president as the ultimate president. But here's the way to say, we are the reform party too. Now that strategy is just, it's not, just far enough outside normal thinking. It's like way outside normal thinking. It's certifiable kind of way to think about running a political campaign. But I think that if people, if we could get a kind of movement to get close to that, that actually is the thing that has the dynamic necessary to win. And here's why. This is what is ultimately most depressing about this dynamic. In the paperback edition of Republic Lost, I write afterward, and I was a strong Obama supporter, and I thought the reason to support Obama over Hillary Clinton was that Obama said, this is the issue I'm going to take on. Change the way Washington works, deal with the power of the lobbyists. If we don't deal with the lobbyists, then none of our problems are going to be dealt with. So this is the issue I'm going to take on. And Hillary Clinton during the campaign was like, what are you talking about? We're not going to deal with that issue. We're going to deal with trying to get what we can't deal with that issue. And I was so animated during the campaign, like, no, she doesn't get it. She doesn't get it. She doesn't get it. Well, in the afterward to the paperback, I said, actually, I think I and Obama didn't get it. Because I think what Hillary Clinton realized is there is no way for a normal president to take on this issue. Because what that president calculates is, if I take on this issue, I'm taking on Congress. And if I take on Congress, I'm taking on my party too. And if I take on my party too, I will never get anything passed after, even if I'm successful in this reform. because I will have alienated my party completely. So from the business model of a successful president, this is completely anathema to that business model, because a successful president is one who gets a bunch of legislation passed, gets reelected, and then gets to be coronated as like the perpetual loved figure in American history, despite the outrages that he or she does as president. Okay, so that business model is not consistent with reforming Congress. And so I said in the end of the book, this is why I think Hillary was probably right. There's no way for a president, a normal president, to bring about this kind of reform of Congress. But that, I think, reinforces the point that, okay, let's have a kind of abnormal president. Think of it as a regent president or a bankruptcy judge president who just basically says, look, I'm just here to fix the system, and then I'm away. And so I think it's right to say that's actually a plausible strategy for doing it, even though I do think, against the background of my social epistemology point, it's kind of an insane way to talk about solving the problem. You had your hand up, yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to kind of follow up to this question. We've seen all the damage that these legal challenges have done for Citizens United and potentially this year through the McCutcheon case. I'm wondering if there's any route where legal challenges can put an end to existing election law in a different way, in a positive way towards what you're looking at here.
Yeah, so I obviously think the Supreme Court has made things much worse. And I think that they're wrong in a whole bunch of ways in which they think about this issue. But unlike most people who talk about this issue, I don't think we should be focusing our energy on the Supreme Court. Because the thing to recognize is if the Supreme Court had given us everything we wanted, decided Citizens United the other way, if when they probably decide McCutcheon tomorrow, they decided in the right way, if they decided the other issue in Buckley the other way, it still would be the case that the funding of campaigns through private means, the way we fund it right now, would produce this enormous power in the tiniest fraction of the 1%. So that is the core problem we have to solve. And there is no decision of the Supreme Court that would fix that. I showed that book, The Wealth Primary, by Bonifaz and Jamie Raskin. They actually, in that book, 1994 book, they intended it to be the brief for a legal action to challenge the current funding system under the Equal Protection Clause. And they imagined the Supreme Court declaring the funding system for political elections unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause. And I love that both of those guys are great. Their work is really important. Jamie Raskin's a really important state senator leader in Maryland right now. But I think it's crazy talk to imagine the Supreme Court declaring private funding of campaigns unconstitutional. It's just not going to happen. So rather than devoting our energy to convincing 5 justices of the Supreme Court to do something, we've got to focus on the really hard problem, which is to convince Americans that we have to change the way we fund elections. So I'm happy people do work on the judicial stuff. I hope they win. But even if they got everything they wanted, we still have an enormously difficult challenge to convince the public. We have to undertake the challenge of funding elections publicly, as opposed to allowing them to be privately funded and therefore create the green primary that necessarily produces the corruption I'm talking about. Yeah.
Thank you for the inspiring speech. I have 2 questions. So first, I have a second thought about the investors. I mean, of course, they are only 0.5% of the population. They might be CEO of big corporations, but in order for them, for the CEO to spend that huge amount of money to hire the lobbyists, they needed the consent from the board, and they might still represent so many employees working for them and their family. So do you think it is possible that the lasters may have a bigger representation than their own population? They might be like 4% of the population, 5%. I mean, still not big enough to be democratic, but there still might be a chance, I think. And the second question is that, because I'm studying religion, and I'm wondering, as a reformer, like you have this so strong moral stance that you have to win this reform. And so as a leader like you, how much do you think have take you to give others hope, to tell them that there is still hope to make this happen? Have you ever sacrificed any personal issues? Does it sometimes become so hard Have you ever become hopeless like that?
So two great questions. Let's start with the first. So it's true that you can say that the funders might be speaking for a broader range of interests, because if they're representing corporate interests. But the first point to recognize is the incredible amount of work that's been done to demonstrate the gap between the interest of the shareholders and the interest of the managers with respect to political speech. John Coates, my colleague at Harvard, has done incredible work to demonstrate that shareholders should want to radically restrict the ability of managers to spend money like this, because it turns out most of the managers spending money like this are doing it for their own personal benefit. They're like on their way to the United States Senate, or they're trying to raise their status inside of political circles that doesn't have any necessary connection to the ultimate value of the corporation for the shareholders. So that's the first point. And the second point is, it might be that it increases the interest here. But we have to remember what the interest is being directed towards, right? It's interesting when you do focus groups on this, you will sometimes get people who will say, you didn't say anything remotely like this, so I don't mean to attribute it to you, but you will get some people who will say, well, yeah, the people spending the most money are actually the most intelligent people or the most talented people. You know, it's a great thing that Bill Gates would spend all this money. He turns out not to, but it's a great thing he'd spend it because he's such a smart guy. But of course, the money is not being spent by people who are focused on how to make America the best that America can be. It's being spent by people who are focused on how to make the return to that interest as high as it can be. And part of the problem is, conceding the point about the intelligence and the sophistication, is that they are very sophisticated in figuring out how to bend policy to bend their particular interest as opposed to advance the public interest. So they're really good. You know, the Koch brothers, of course, give all sorts of money to charity and do good with it. But their most important political consequence of their spending money in political elections is to undermine the ability of environmental protection agencies to do their work. And that has a direct benefit on their corporate bottom line because, of course, it makes it easier for them to have profits against the background of no. Now, they're able to do that because they're so smart, you know, but what we need is people who are focused on what the public interest would be rather than that particular private interest. As to the second part about, you know, personal sacrifice, you know, so I've got lots of friends and I've got a huge family and young children who are very engaged and supportive and a wife who's hanging around for at least a couple more years, she promises. So, you know, I'm not suffering on that side. But there are, you know, I think it's important to recognize there are opportunities that standing just far enough outside exclude you from. You know, so Barack Obama was a colleague of mine at Chicago. He's a guy I would go to dinner with when we were both at Chicago. So he was a friend. And when I thought, my God, a guy like I know, a friend, is going to become president, I thought, you know, this is really cool. This is going to be really amazing. You know, the opportunity to do, you know, policy making right, I thought was great, given the views that I had, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Very soon into his administration, I wrote a piece in The Nation criticizing the Obama administration for its failure to take any steps towards the direction of reform that it had promised. And that was costly. You know, basically, there was no further contact that I had with that administration from that moment on. You know, there were more times that the Bush administration reached out to me to ask for my advice about what to do in various policies than the Obama administration, even though I would never have voted for George Bush, no matter what you had done to me. The point was, I had crossed an important line with Barack Obama's administration, and there was no going back. And it, you know, so it disqualifies you from certain conventional rewards. The rewards that, you know, the convention sort of offers. And you've got to be willing to accept that. And for some people, I'm not saying I like it or I'm looking for it. I kind of regret it in some ways. But When you come to believe, as I believe, that the issue that I'm working on is the most important issue, and that we are losing our capacity to govern, and we are not at a stage of history where large governments can afford not to have the capacity to govern, it's almost as if there's no choice. Of course you're going to have to work on this issue. But that doesn't mean you don't recognize the way in which working on it, at least in a certain way, makes you crazy. And crazy people don't get certain kind of rewards in our society. But embrace the insanity. That's my argument. Embrace the insanity. Let's all be insane together.
Thank you very much
Yeah.
for coming out, Professor. I'm glad you're talking about this issue. I heard about your book a couple years ago on Fareed Zakaria's GPS. He gave you guys a nice plug. And as a Fletcher student, I have the privilege of taking classes at Harvard. And it's a great institution, and they do a lot of great things. So one of the things I noticed that's really different over there is the promotion of leadership, which plays a critical role in all of this. One thing I had the pleasure of is learning about how the institution talks about leadership and ways that it attracts people and guides them through leadership. And there's kind of an environment that's created around, maybe not the culture, I think, but just the environment around leadership and the relationships that are built and the things you have to do in order to get to those positions. And I think it was one of the first times where I learned the lesson that I realized that there are limits to what is possible for me in life and who can go into some circles and who can't, was taking classes at Harvard. And I'm curious because you talk about the 91% who think that there's no way to do anything and the 96 who think there needs to be change. I'm definitely within that and thinks there needs to be change. And mine's more of just an antidote that it's because we believe that there's no effect that I can directly get and do as a result, but that small gap, the people who are there that have that connection and it takes place in, those institutions, they can. They have the money to spend. They have the guy in the Rolodex who can make that change. And yes, they do receive the direct benefits. So my larger question to you would be not so much how do you affect the change, but how do you make that connection more tangible for people, for the 91% who don't believe? And I also do sit in quite an elite institution and have the access that most Americans don't have to people like that, but it's still not possible for me, I think. How do you make that more real, the connection?
Yeah. So let's first of all be precise about what those two numbers are referring to. There certainly is a percentage of Americans out there who believe they have enormous influence because of their Rolodex or whatever, because they employ 1,000 people, because they get to give lectures in front of thousands of people. Those people feel like they have influence. And people who don't have those resources don't feel like they have influence. But the precise description I was offering is of people who believe the system can be changed and people who don't. So among the 91% could be some of the most powerful people in America. Indeed, likely are, because what they see is there's no chance in hell that K Street would ever allow such a bill to be passed. It just never would happen. They would never allow that to happen. Why? Because if the reform I'm talking about happened, the power of the wealth of K Street would collapse. I mean, we would always have lobbyists. We need lobbyists. Lobbyists are really important. But the extra power they have would disappear. And they have that power because of their central role in the funding system. As John Edwards used to say when we used to quote John Edwards, there's all the difference in the world between a lawyer who makes an argument to a jury and a lawyer who hands out $100 bills to the jurors. Well, that's the distinction our lobbying system doesn't have right now. And all we would have is lobbyists who are making arguments. Those arguments would be valuable, but they wouldn't be as valuable as they are right now. So the value of K Street would collapse. And so one of the very wealthy, influential people might well say, therefore, it will never happen. Never happen. So the 5%, you can think about it like that, the difference between the 96% who want it to happen and the 91% who don't think it can happen, the 5% in the middle, are people who believe that it can happen. And so how do we increase the 5% to be 50% or 70%? I think the way to do it is actually, it's a different talk from the one I've offered tonight, but it's actually just to show the practical specific, to emphasize the question that was talking about particulars, specific steps that would have to be taken. Like, what are those specific steps? So one of the reasons we marched across New Hampshire, and by the end we had about 200 people participating in this march across New Hampshire in January, 185 miles in January, was to get people in New Hampshire to focus on their very powerful role in the election cycle. They are their own kind of Lesters inside of our democracy, because what happens in the New Hampshire primary radically affects what happens for the rest of the presidential primary. And if New Hampshire focuses on an issue and determines the winner of the Republican and Democratic primary on the basis of that issue, that will ramify throughout the rest of the presidential campaign. So it's getting those people in New Hampshire to recognize, geez, 50,000 people in New Hampshire binding together on this particular issue could flip the presidential elections. The difference between Obama and Hillary Clinton in 2008 was 8,000 votes. So 50,000 people bound together on this particular issue would clearly have a substantial effect in how the campaign could be decided, assuming there was a candidate who was on the right side of this issue. So you begin to give people a sense of, geez, it's not hard to imagine pulling together 50,000 people out of a state of 1.3 million people. So there's something we can do. Let's build that. Let's start, weaving a briar patch in New Hampshire so that every time a presidential candidate speaks, the first question they get in response to the audience is, what are you going to do to end the system of corruption in Washington? That's a very tangible thing people can imagine happening. You begin to give them tangible things they can imagine happening that begin to make it plausible that you create the pressure necessary to bring about that change. Now, we can imagine that in New Hampshire. You couldn't imagine that in California. It's just too big, it's too diffuse. But there's this chokehold on the presidential primary through New Hampshire that is a possibility. And I think the more people focused on that, the more people began to imagine that there was a way to change it. And I think that's the kind of work that we have to do. We get that 5% up to a majority of Americans, then that's the thawing that I say we've got to do in order to liberate the potential movement here from the resignation that keeps it locked up right now. So we have one more question back there. Is the last question? Yeah.
I was struck by the fact that you raised the Koch brothers, which everybody does, who has concerns about campaign finance. So the Koch brothers and their anti-EPA stance. Okay, well, Tom Steyer, who is on the other side, has just come in with his $100 million and is going to fight the battle on the other side. What do you make of his way of dealing with this? Because he's a quote unquote, trying to do good.
Yeah. So I admire what he's trying to do. I think he's fundamentally mistaken. He's mistaken both in the short term and in the long term. He's mistaken in the short term because that kind of money being spent in such a clear way backfires in political elections, at least on our side. So one of the things that Elizabeth Warren was worried about in her election campaign was that Steyer was going to spend that kind of money. And if he had, to support her, if he had, then that would have just fueled the kind of anti-outsider skepticism that could have weakened her campaign. So I don't think it's actually necessarily successful. But I think the more important point is it ignores the more fundamental problem that exists inside. And I'm in the process of having a dialogue with Steyer's, his brother is actually a friend of mine, about this. Because if you took the same resources and you devoted it towards changing the way elections were funded, then you wouldn't have to spend $100 million to get sensible environmental policy. It wouldn't cost that much. You just have to get people who are focused on sensible policy as opposed to focused on taking care of their funders. And one of the ideas that we've talked about since Republic Lost came out is a kind of super PAC to end all super PACs. And the idea is basically you go around to 50 Tom Steyers and you say to them, in a Kickstarter-like way, contingently commit to give me $50 million if I can get $50 million from 49 other people. Well, if you had $2.5 billion to wage a war with, we could change Congress like that. It would take nothing. $2.5 billion would, that'd be the largest amount of money ever put together for any cause ever. There it is in the political system. And unlike the Koch brothers' money or even Tom Steyer's money, it has a kind of self-negating effect. You can imagine the ads where people say, I'm spending $50 million so that I have as much power in this political system as you do. Right? This is about making it so I'm no longer as powerful as I am right now. It's a kind of irony, but it wouldn't take much for people to embrace that irony. So I'm for embracing the insanity. I'm for embracing the irony. The point is, we need that kind of move here more than we need somebody saying, okay, we have a corrupt system, so I'm just going to rally my money against the money on the other side. And then the long-term point is, look, there will be Tom Steyers till the end of time, but there's never going to be enough of them because the incentive to invest in government to protect your economic interests will always be stronger than the incentive to invest in government to protect a public interest. That's just the nature of the public good. And to somehow imagine that we're going to inspire enough resources on the side of the public good versus on the side of private interest is just, I think, kind of hopelessly naive. I'm much more interested in people who are willing to spend that kind of money to change the system than people who are willing to spend that kind of money, even for a cause that I believe deeply in, which I certainly believe deeply in the cause Tom Steyer is trying to advance. So I'm grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.